You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. On a humid Monday morning in Vietnam in the fall of 2003, 12-year-old An Bui sat at her school desk. She was bent over her notebook, working on a writing assignment, when her left hand got sweaty and started cramping. She dropped her pencil to shake her hand out and noticed the pencil had blood on it. An looked down and saw a smear of blood across her palm, but she didn't remember cutting her hand on anything. She grabbed a tissue from her backpack and wiped off the blood. She thought maybe the pencil had given her a splinter, but she couldn't see a cut anywhere. And the red liquid on her palm definitely was not paint or some other substance. It was blood, and it seemed to have come out of nowhere. An didn't like it when people looked at her, so she threw the bloody tissue into her backpack before anybody noticed. She decided not to tell anyone what had happened. The blood must have just gotten on her hand at some point that morning, and she didn't notice. An figured whatever it was not worth worrying about. So she turned her attention back to the lesson and tried to put the strange moment out of her head. A few months later, An was reading at her desk, trying to ignore a headache. It was hot and muggy, which only made the headache worse. Her forehead was covered in sweat, and she felt a bead of moisture slide down her nose. She wiped it with the back of her hand, and as she did, she noticed a smear of blood. Her forehead was bleeding. An immediately looked down at her desk and let her hair fall around her face so nobody could see it. She tried to be inconspicuous as she touched her forehead, searching for a cut. The skin was unbroken, but there was more blood on her fingertips. And to make matters even stranger, there was a small pool of blood in her palm as well. She was stunned. Blood seemed to be seeping out of her hand and forehead for no reason. Then, An heard someone whispering behind her. She turned around and saw two of her classmates huddled together and pointing at her. Then another girl noticed and tapped the boy next to her on the shoulder. Within seconds, the whole class was gawking at her. An was mortified. She darted out of the room and down the hall to the bathroom. She made sure nobody else was inside. Then she turned on the faucet and scrubbed her hands and face until all the blood was gone. And then after that, she inspected her forehead and palms in the mirror, but there weren't any cuts on her body. An couldn't understand where this blood was coming from, but she still didn't want to tell the teacher or her mom. To her, that would just make the whole problem worse. And right now, all she wanted to do was forget this morning ever happened. One afternoon, a year later, An's mother, Tui, was walking An home from school. She tried to ask her daughter about how her day went, but An just stared at her feet as they shuffled down the busy sidewalk. An, who was 13 years old now, had spent the past year acting very quiet and withdrawn. She was always checking her reflection in shop windows and running her hands over her face like she was checking for acne or something. Plus, An wasn't in any school activities this year. An had always been shy, but she was becoming a loner. Tui wasn't sure what to do about it. Once they got home, An kicked off her shoes and went straight into the living room without saying a word. But Tui cried out in surprise when she saw that An was leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the ceramic floor. She ran to her daughter to see if she was hurt. An whirled around and looked down at the floor, but instead of checking her feet for an injury, she began wiping her forehead and inspecting her palms. Tui asked what was going on, but An didn't say anything. Instead, she just flopped down onto the couch and buried her face in her palms. Tui felt like her daughter must be hiding something, and so speaking very firmly, she told An to explain right now. An looked up, her face shiny with sweat. Then, red droplets began falling down An's forehead. Tui couldn't believe her eyes. It looked like An was sweating blood. But An didn't seem shocked by this at all. Instead, An just seemed sort of embarrassed. Then Tui remembered something. Over the past year, she'd occasionally found small traces of blood on An's clothes. She hadn't thought much of it. She figured An got little scrapes and cuts sometimes, like all kids do. But now, Tui asked her daughter if all those stains had been this bloody sweat. An nodded and said yes, then burst into tears. An said she was absolutely miserable. For the past year, in addition to sweating blood, she'd been spontaneously bleeding from her palms, the soles of her feet, her scalp, sometimes her arms and legs, and even her torso. And so her classmates thought she was really weird, and they made fun of An every time this happened. And also her friends didn't talk to her anymore because of the bleeding. the whole school basically shunned her for being this freak. An said she had tried her best to hide the bleeding, but occasionally she would bleed through her school uniform and everybody would see. Tui didn't know what to think. She couldn't believe that she hadn't realized this was going on. But at this point, all she thought was her daughter clearly needed help. She had to get An to the doctor as soon as possible. A few days later, a physician at the local hospital named Dr. Nai Nguyen stood in an exam room with An and Tui. As she inspected An's scalp, An explained how this spontaneous bleeding had basically made her a laughingstock at school and was ruining her life. Now, Dr. Nguyen could tell that An was clearly deeply distressed here, but far more pressing to the doctor were these symptoms. They were so confusing. Dr. Nguyen had never heard of anybody spontaneously bleeding from their extremities like this. It was totally alarming, and while Dr. Nguyen would never say this out loud, especially to An, it was a bit creepy too. The doctor was very cautious as she combed through An's hair, searching for cuts, scars, ulcers, anything that might explain the bleeding. But there was no markings of any kind on An's scalp or anywhere else on her body. And so after the exam, Dr. Nguyen peeled off her latex gloves and told Tui that she wanted to admit her daughter to the hospital to run some more tests. She would test An's blood to see if An had an underlying disease like anemia or a blood clotting problem, which might explain the sudden bleeding. She would also check for infectious disease. Whatever was wrong with An, Dr. Nguyen was confident that the lab work would show what was going on. But a few days later, Dr. Nguyen got the test results back. And An's blood work, her urine test, the chest x-ray Dr. Nguyen ordered, all of these tests came back normal. On paper, An was completely healthy. Even a malaria test came back negative. Dr. Nguyen couldn't find a single reason for An's bleeding. And unfortunately, even though An claimed to have bled at least a few times since being admitted to the hospital, Dr. Nguyen had never been present to witness the onset of the bleeding, which made Dr. Nguyen consider a different possibility. An said she often bled from her palms, feet, forehead, and torso. And while Dr. Nguyen was not Christian, she still knew these were the same locations on the body where, according to Christian doctrine, Jesus had bled from during his crucifixion. And according to some Christians, they believe these wounds can appear on others like a holy marking. These markings, which mirrored the wounds from the nails in Jesus' hands and feet, the crown of thorns on his forehead, and the spear wound in his side, are known as stigmata. And so Dr. Nguyen began to wonder if An wasn't actually sick, but faking these stigmata-like wounds for religious reasons, or just for attention. An did say that everybody in school knew who she was now because of this bleeding, so she was getting lots of attention. She said they treated her like a freak, but Dr. Nguyen knew that attention seekers didn't always search for positive validation. Negative attention could feel just as rewarding. If An was faking this, that would also explain why An hid the condition from her mom for more than a year, and why no one at the hospital had actually seen An while she was actively bleeding. The blood always seemed to appear when she was alone, so doctors hadn't been able to determine where it was actually coming from. Dr. Nguyen realized this situation was going to be very tricky. An would almost certainly insist that her symptoms were real, and it would be up to Dr. Nguyen to figure out if she was lying or in genuine need of medical intervention. The next morning, Dr. Nguyen walked into An's hospital room as An was finishing breakfast. Tui sat in a chair against the wall, flipping through a magazine. Dr. Nguyen closed the door for privacy and told Tui and An about the test results. She explained that without any evidence, it was going to be very difficult to diagnose An with a medical condition. As An and Tui absorbed the news and looked pretty upset about it, Dr. Nguyen turned to An and told her very gently that, school can be very stressful and bullying especially can make people really upset. And so it would be totally understandable if when An was feeling overwhelmed at school, that maybe she had begun to fake these symptoms, maybe to get out of a test or just to get out of a room or something. But the second Dr. Nguyen said this, An just stared at her with a look of pure disbelief on her face. She promised Dr. Nguyen that she had never faked the bleeding. She said she would just feel achy sometimes and then the blood would appear. She had no idea why this was happening, but it was ruining her life. She would never do this on purpose. Now, Dr. Nguyen was expecting this reaction, and so in an attempt to catch An off guard, she just said, "An, are you causing these wounds yourself to look like the stigmata?" An and her mother exchanged very confused glances. Tui shifted uncomfortably in her seat and explained that they were not Christian, they were Buddhist. There was nothing in their beliefs about bleeding hands or feet, and An said she'd never even heard of stigmata. The room fell into a brief silence, and then Dr. Nguyen had to admit that if An wasn't Christian, it was unlikely she was faking stigmata wounds. She could still be faking the symptoms for attention, but Dr. Nguyen still thought it was possible that An truly had a mysterious medical illness. And so if Dr. Nguyen was going to be able to help An, she would need more information. And so on her way back to her office, Dr. Nguyen stopped at the nurse's station, and she gave the staff strict orders to watch An closely and to let her know if the girl did anything unexpected or strange. A few hours later, Dr. Nguyen was getting ready to go home when she got a call. An Bui was bleeding. Dr. Nguyen hurried down the hallway to An's room, and when she stepped inside, she saw An sitting on the bed just staring back at her, and there was blood all across her pillow. An's mother was standing next to the bed looking very confused. Dr. Nguyen asked Tui if she had seen the bleeding begin, but Tui said no, she was asleep when it started. When Dr. Nguyen looked over at the nurse on duty, she shook her head no as well. She had not seen the bleeding start. She said that she had checked on An 15 minutes earlier and nothing was happening, and when she came back, An was bleeding. Dr. Nguyen snapped on a pair of latex gloves and then told An she was going to search for the source of the bleeding. Then she started moving her fingers through An's hair and pressing down on her scalp. And as she did, she could see blood smeared in An's hair, but she couldn't tell where it was coming from. She asked if An was in any pain, and An said yes, she had a headache, and she said she was feeling very tired. Finally, after not finding the source of the bleeding, Dr. Nguyen stepped back and told An that she wanted to take a few samples of the skin from An's scalp for testing. The procedure was called a punch biopsy. She would numb An's scalp and then cut out 3 little patches of skin and hair follicles, each about 3 millimeters long. After hearing this, An began to cry and said she did not want another test. Dr. Nguyen nodded and said she understood, but she told An this test could help them figure out what was actually wrong with her, and then hopefully she could get treated and go home. It took a minute for An to calm down, but eventually she did, and then she told the doctor she was ready to get started. The following morning, Dr. Nguyen received the biopsy results, and they showed something fascinating. An's scalp was covered in these microscopic pockets filled with blood. Dr. Nguyen didn't know why these spaces had formed or what was causing them to burst, but she intended to find out. Dr. Nguyen, during the biopsy, had also collected some of the bloody mixture that coated An's scalp, and results showed that it was actually a mixture of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and sweat. And it was the sweat that gave Dr. Nguyen an idea. She told An to go to the stress testing room in the cardiology department. And when Dr. Nguyen arrived, An was already standing glumly on the treadmill. An stared angrily at Dr. Nguyen, while a technician clipped the safety cord to her shirt, and a nurse double-knotted An's shoelaces. Dr. Nguyen couldn't blame An for being annoyed here, but she didn't have time to argue with an angry child. She had a case to solve. Because the bloody mixture contained sweat, Dr. Nguyen wondered if she could induce the bleeding with vigorous exercise. And so she was going to have An sprint on the treadmill to see if she could make her sweat turn red. Once everything was all set up, Dr. Nguyen nodded to the technician. The treadmill belt began moving, and the technician ramped up the speed until An was running. In no time, she was breathing hard and sweating. Except there wasn't any blood in the sweat. So Dr. Nguyen had the technician turn up the speed of the treadmill. As the belt moved faster, An struggled to keep up. Dr. Nguyen crossed her fingers, hoping that blood would appear on the girl's forehead. An's face grew pink and then beet red from the exertion. For a moment, Dr. Nguyen thought the blood was poking through An's skin, but then she realized An was just bright red from running so hard. Her sweat was still clear. Dr. Nguyen felt defeated as she told the tech to shut the treadmill down. Dr. Nguyen forced herself to smile. She told On she did great work, but she was secretly very frustrated. If a stress test didn't cause the bloody sweat, Dr. Nguyen didn't know what would, and so it made her turn back to her initial suspicion that On might somehow be causing the bleeding herself. Now, she couldn't understand how On might make her own scalp bleed, but it had been more than a week and still no one at the hospital had seen the actual onset of On's bleeding. Her own mom hadn't even seen it. And so if On was deceiving everybody, then Dr. Nguyen wanted to put an end to it, today. And so Dr. Nguyen pulled On's nurse aside and told her to sit by On's bedside overnight and to watch the child like a hawk. She told the nurse not to leave On alone, not even for a moment. A few hours later, On was startled awake in her hospital bed. Her forehead was pounding and she was drenched in sweat. It took a moment for On's eyes to focus, but when they did, she realized her nurse was standing right over her, looking absolutely stunned. On sat up and instinctively felt her face. And as she did, she immediately understood why this nurse was staring at her. On's face was covered in red, sweaty blood. She could feel it oozing out of her pores and trickling down her chin. But instead of helping her clean up, the nurse was just gawking at her. On closed her eyes and hoped the nurse would go away. She felt like a zoo animal on display for the whole hospital. When she opened her eyes again, the nurse was still looming over her, but instead of staring at her, the nurse smiled and told On she was going to call Dr. Nguyen. And she told On that she was now certain On could not be faking her symptoms. On was so relieved. A few days later, On would get her diagnosis. Once On had begun bleeding in her sleep in full view of that nurse, Dr. Nguyen was convinced the bleeding truly was spontaneous. But she still didn't understand why it was happening. After thoroughly searching medical literature for cases of spontaneous bleeding from the hands, feet, and head, Dr. Nguyen eventually discovered a rare condition that matched On's presentation. Its scientific name is hematidrosis. Now, not much is known about hematidrosis, but it's a condition that causes tiny blood vessels in the skin to break open. The blood inside these vessels might get squeezed out through the sweat glands or leak into hair follicles, causing the patient to essentially sweat blood. Doctors don't know exactly what triggers hematidrosis, but they think it could be related to stress, like the fight-or-flight response. This condition has been reported only in a limited number of documented cases, making it difficult to study extensively. However, there are some historical reports of similar cases. Some scholars believe that many documented cases of stigmata throughout history were actually just misdiagnosed cases of hematidrosis, which technically would have made Dr. Nguyen's initial diagnosis correct. On was suffering from stigmata, but not for religious reasons. In fact, Dr. Nguyen never discovered what actually caused On's bleeding episodes. But she did find a way to cure them. Dr. Nguyen prescribed On lorazepam, a mild benzodiazepine commonly used to treat depression. It helped reduce On's anxiety, and after 2 months on the medication, the bleeding stopped. It was a bright summer day in 1906, and Dr. William C. Clark and his wife Harriet were driving slowly through a beautiful part of northwestern Connecticut called Litchfield County. Litchfield is a rural, very hilly area with lots of winding country roads, and the Clarks were there to try to scout out an area to build their second home. The couple lived full-time in New York City, where Dr. Clark was an oncologist, which is a cancer doctor, and he was also a professor at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. And while the Clarks' lives were very exciting and fulfilling in the city, they were also very hectic and chaotic, and so the reason they had settled on Litchfield as the place to look for a location for their second home is because it was the total opposite of the city. It was quiet, it was peaceful, it was perfect. And so as this couple from New York City drove along these winding backcountry roads, they eventually reached this beautiful covered wooden bridge, and after they drove across it, they got this view up onto this mountainside off to their right, and high up on this mountain was this huge, shaded, beautiful forest. And they saw there was a road that appeared to kind of spider off and go into these woods. Now, the couple had no idea what was up there, but it was just so beautiful, and they were immediately so drawn to it that they decided they would go check it out and see if maybe there was a spot for their second home in these woods. And so Dr. Clark took the car and he went up this access road, and very quickly, as they began climbing up this hillside, the road became very bumpy and overgrown. It was pretty obvious that not many cars were driving into these woods, and so before they even reached the tree line, Dr. Clark had to pull the car over and park it on the side of the road, and then he and Harriet got out, and then on foot, they continued up towards the forest. And once the couple actually entered the forest, immediately the sunlight faded because the canopy over their heads was so thick, and the air became cool and refreshing. And after walking for only a couple of minutes, the forest, which at first seemed very still and quiet, suddenly became alive. They could hear birds chirping and animals running around and insects buzzing. And then up ahead, they saw there was this field off to the side of the road that was full of all these wild apple trees growing in all different directions. And as they got closer, they saw there was just a deer right in the middle of the apple trees eating apples directly off the branches. And then just past all these apple trees, the couple began passing these huge, beautiful patches of roses and lilacs and bright yellow bitter tansy flowers that lined the road. And then before long, the couple was stepping over these babbling brooks, and off in the distance, they could hear the sound of running water like fresh spring water coming down off the mountain. And then, as the sun did begin to poke through the canopy above them, it almost looked like the forest was sparkling, literally. This forest was sitting on a hillside, and the hillside, which was made up of rock, had mica inside of it. And mica is a kind of mineral that when sunlight hits it, it almost looks like it's shimmering. And of course, there were the owls. As Dr. Clark and his wife walked farther and farther into this beautiful forest, they heard more and more owls hooting off in the distance. And to the Clarks, this made the forest feel enchanted. It was like the owls were personally greeting them. By the time the couple had turned around and begun heading back to their car, they had already made up their mind that they were going to build their second home in that forest. And so, after returning to their home in New York, they promptly put in the paperwork to purchase 1,000 acres inside of that Connecticut forest. And that forest had a name. It was called Dark Entry, and it was named that because it looked like from the outside, the forest was basically dark all the time. There was shade cast on it from mountains nearby, and then also the canopy inside of Dark Entry is exceptionally thick. At one time, there actually had been a town inside of Dark Entry Forest. However, all the people who had lived in that town were now all gone. The only remnants of this town were a couple of crumbling stone walls and a couple of home foundations that were scattered about the Dark Entry forest floor. The Clarks had seen some of these ruins as they walked along this overgrown path through the forest, but they weren't concerned. Instead, they felt like these ruins actually added some charm to the forest. After the land purchase was finalized, Dr. Clark began looking for local builders in Connecticut who could help him build this second home inside of Dark Entry Forest. But no matter how much money he offered these local Connecticut builders, they all said no. Now, none of them gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they were turning him down, so Dr. Clark just kind of assumed that, hey, this project is not huge, it's just one house, and the forest is pretty isolated and hard to get to, and so he thought, probably these builders think it's not worth the effort. But Dr. Clark was not discouraged. He decided he would just build the house himself. After all, he was a very handy, competent guy who had grown up on a farm in New Jersey, and so he knew how to build things. And so, for the next several months, Dr. Clark would travel from New York City to Dark Entry Forest every weekend, and he would build this home. First, he cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees on this one flat patch of his land, and then with all this lumber he had cut down, he built his rustic two-story cabin on this flat part of his land.
And then nearby on this hilltop, there was a freshwater spring at the top. And so he laid piping from the spring into his cabin so they could have fresh water. And then at the bottom of this nearby hill was this brook. And Dr. Clark loved just standing and watching this brook because inside of it were all these trout that would dart all around. And so Dr. Clark built a swimming pool with beautiful mossy embankments right up against this brook so he could sit there and watch the fish. By Thanksgiving of that year, the cabin was done, and so Dr. Clark and his wife Harriet, they stayed at the cabin to celebrate the holiday. And as they were sitting in their swimming pool watching the trout and listening to the owls hoot off in the distance, they both agreed that this second home was like their little piece of heaven. So every summer from there on out, and every major holiday that they could manage it, the Clarks would travel to their home in Dark Entry Forest, and they would swim and hike and relax, and they'd watch the leaves on the mountainside turn from green to bright yellows and oranges and reds. It was perfect. That is, until 1918. That summer, the couple was in their second home in the forest when Dr. Clark was suddenly called back to New York to attend to a medical emergency. Harriet was very upset at the prospect of suddenly being left alone in this cabin in the middle of the forest by herself for who knows how many days. And so when she dropped her husband off at the nearby train platform, she made him promise that he would come back soon, and he said he would. And then Dr. Clark got on the train, it took off, and Harriet just stood there with her arms crossed, watching it as it chugged along off into the distance. From his comfortable seat on that train, Dr. Clark had no idea that his wife was about to endure a nightmare while he was gone. We've all been there. Your guests are on their way over to your house for your big New Year's Eve party, and right as they pull into your driveway, you realize you've over-nogged your smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog. And so with minutes to spare, you leap out of the window, shattering the glass and cutting yourself up badly, and then you jog up to Canada and dive into Baffin Bay, and you jump on top of a narwhal, and after some intense underwater hand-to-flipper combat, you take its horn off its head, and you beat it to death. You take its horn, and then you swim back to land, and you jog back to your house, and you leap in through a different window, shattering the glass. And then after you stand up, you make your way into the kitchen, and you whip up a quick narwhal horn iced soup right as your guests are walking through the front door. Crisis averted, right? Wrong. Smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog and narwhal horn iced soup are both just gross. So your party was doomed either way. But you know what isn't gross? HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal service that delivers actually good-tasting food right to your doorstep. With over 35 recipes available every week, there is something to please everyone. Choose from family-friendly, fit and wholesome, even veggie. Plus, you can easily customize your meals or sides, upgrading your proteins, or even adding a protein to your veggie meal. And if you're going to be traveling this New Year's, HelloFresh can accommodate your schedule. You can change your preferences, delivery day, and your address in just a few clicks. So, if you're ready to stop garnishing your holiday parties with trash food and drink, then sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Okay, back to the story. When the Clarks bought their 1,000 acres in the Dark Entry Forest, they did virtually no research on the forest or the surrounding area. If they had, they very likely would not have purchased that land. You see, the town that used to be inside of the Dark Entry Forest, that was now just ruins that the Clarks saw when they first walked around inside of the forest, was abandoned for a very specific reason. It was cursed. At least that's what the locals say. And in fact, that was the reason why no builders in the area were willing to go with Dr. Clark into the forest to go build his house, because they were too scared to go anywhere near the ruins of this cursed town. This town, which was known as Dudleytown, was first settled sometime in the 1740s. At first, it was just a couple of people and a couple of small structures, but pretty quickly, 30 families had moved in, and it was a thriving little town. But as the 1700s came to a close, terrible things began to happen to residents of this town. First, there was the Carter family. They moved to Dudleytown in 1759, and shortly after arriving there, 6 members of their family all died suddenly from cholera. The remaining branch of the Carter family was so grief-stricken from their losses that they left Dudleytown and went to New York, where they resettled. But almost immediately after getting set up there, Native Americans raided their property and massacred them, and the 3 people that survived this massacre were 3 of the kids, and they were all kidnapped and taken away. In 1792, a Dudley resident named Hollister died suddenly. Now, we don't know if he fell off a roof or if he was murdered, no one really knows, but what we can agree on is that his untimely death happened in the home of a man named Tanner. And Tanner, following Hollister's death, suddenly just began obsessively talking about these strange creatures he was seeing out in the woods at night, kind of roaming around the dark entry forest. And he talked about it all the time, and nobody listened to him. And eventually, Tanner went insane, and his daughter had to care for him for the rest of his life. And while Tanner was slowly losing his mind, his next-door neighbor, named Abel, also began reporting that he was seeing weird creatures roaming around the tree line all around the town. And as Abel continued to report seeing these strange creatures lurking in the shadows, he too slowly went mad and had to be cared for until his death. In the early 1800s, a famous Revolutionary War hero, General Herman Swift, who lived in Dudleytown, lost his mind shortly after his wife was struck by lightning. And then in 1813, an unknown epidemic rolled through Dudleytown and killed many of its residents. After that, more and more residents of Dudleytown either died suddenly or died mysteriously, and also more and more residents began coming forward with stories about having seen these strange, shadowy creatures moving around the tree line at night. By about 1900, all the Dudleytown residents had either died or simply just left, abandoning their homes, except for one family, the Brophies. But in quick succession, the Brophy family's sheep all died, then the mother died of tuberculosis, then the 2 sons were accused of theft in a nearby town, and then they just disappeared, leaving one person, John Brophy, the father. But the Brophy family home burned to the ground, and so John, who was overcome with grief, just wandered off into the forest and was never heard from again. At that point, Dudleytown officially became a ghost town. No one lived there. And it was at that point, in 1906, when Dr. Clark and Harriet had their beautiful summer's day walk through the forest and discovered where they wanted to build their second home. So, fast forward back to 1918, and Dr. Clark, he's on his medical emergency leave to New York. It winds up being very quick. He's back on a train within 36 hours, and he pulls into the station right near Dark Entry Forest, and he's expecting to see Harriet waiting on the platform for him. But when the train rolled into the station, she wasn't there. Now, Dr. Clark was not a superstitious person, but for some reason, when he didn't see his wife there, he just felt like something was off. There's no reason she wouldn't have come out here to greet him. I mean, she was worried about being all alone in the cabin, and she knew he was going to be arriving at that moment. And so, feeling a little bit panicked, Dr. Clark left the train station and on foot made his way over to the Dark Entry Forest. And when he got there and began walking on that overgrown road path that led to his house, immediately, as soon as he was within the shade of the trees, he began hearing these owls hooting very loudly off in the distance. Now, normally, the sound of these owls hooting made him feel welcome, but this time he felt scared. He felt like something was wrong up ahead. And so he began jogging through the forest, and it's very dark, and all he can hear is the sound of these owls, and it's getting louder and louder and louder. And then finally he reaches the clearing where his property is. And at this point, it's a cacophony of owls hooting practically right on top of him. And he looks up towards his house up on this hill, and he sees the front door is slightly open. And so now, with his heart racing, wondering what's going on with his wife, Dr. Clark runs up to his front porch. He gets to the door and he flings it open the rest of the way, and then right before he stepped into his house, this sudden high-pitched noise began up on the second floor inside of his house. And it was so startling to Dr. Clark that he just froze where he was. And so suddenly it's so loud from the owls all around him and the woods behind him and whatever this noise is that he just stood there unsure what to do. And so as he's sitting there getting the courage up to go investigate his house, he realizes what this high-pitched noise is. It's the sound of maniacal, insane laughter coming from the second floor. Sensing his wife had to be in danger, the doctor charged up the nearby steps up to the second floor, and he could tell this laughter, this high-pitched laughter, was coming from the master bedroom. And so he ran down the short hallway, he got in front of the closed door that led into the master bedroom, he slowly opened it up, and there, in the back corner of his room, was his wife. She was on the ground, rolled up in a ball, facing the door. Her hands were clenched in fists, her eyes were open and unblinking, and her mouth was open wider than was humanly possible. And as he's staring at his wife, wondering what's going on, he realizes this insane, high-pitched laughter is coming from his wife. But it doesn't even look like it's coming out of her. Her chest is just heaving, her mouth is staying open, and the laughter is just coming out of her. And so the doctor just stood there watching his wife, who's staring directly at his eyes. And finally, he just got so scared, he turned and he ran. During Dr. Clark's 36 hours he was away in New York, something happened to his wife. We don't know what it was, but it caused her to lose her mind. The only thing she would talk about was the strange creatures she saw out in the forest. By some accounts, Harriet spent the rest of her life in a mental asylum. By other accounts, she went back with Dr. Clark to New York, where she took her life. Today, Dudleytown is not only still abandoned, but it is also illegal to visit. However, people do still sneak into Dudleytown and walk around the ruins, and many of them have reported feeling these pockets of cold air where there shouldn't be cold air, and also some others have said as they've been walking, they've felt phantom hands slap them and push them. Some have said they've taken photographs inside of the Dark Entry Forest near Dudleytown, and they've captured strange, shadowy figures that they couldn't see with their naked eye. The famous paranormal couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, shot a special series in the 1970s inside of the Dark Entry Forest, and they declared the area around Dudleytown was demonically possessed.